Oh my God, she is gone. Mama Betty, please, no!
Ryu Jin-ho stepped out of the private elevator and into the sprawling penthouse of his Seoul mansion, leaving the violence of the night locked outside the reinforced glass. Below him, the city glittered, a sprawling, neon-lit empire that he ruled with absolute, unyielding ice. As the head of the White Tiger Syndicate, Jin-ho was untouchable. He was a phantom, a whisper of death in the boardroom and the back alleys alike. But tonight, the whispers were inside his own head. The demons were loud tonight. They clawed at his chest, cold and relentless, replaying the hollow thud of a traitor's knees hitting the concrete warehouse floor. He didn't want a drink. He didn't want the company of the silent, terrified women his lieutenants frequently tried to send to his quarters. He walked past the sweeping staircase, past the bowing guards who kept their eyes fixed firmly on the marble floor, and headed toward the back of the estate. He was looking for the only warmth left in his world. Before he even pushed open the heavy oak doors, the scent hit him. It was a sharp, aggressive symphony of toasted garlic, bruised ginger, and the bright, wicked heat of Scotch bonnet peppers. It was a smell that commanded attention. Jin-ho pushed the doors open and stepped into the sanctuary. The kitchen was massive, a gleaming expanse of industrial stainless steel, copper pots, and pristine white marble. At the center of it all stood Mama Betty. She was a force of nature wrapped in a crisp white chef's apron. A black woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes, flawless dark skin, and a posture that refused to yield to anyone. Not even the most feared man in South Korea. Betty didn't just run the kitchen. She commanded it. She was a culinary genius he had poached from a Michelin-starred restaurant in New York 5 years ago, paying her triple her salary and offering her complete autonomy. She was worth every single one. Betty didn't look up from the cast-iron skillet sizzling in front of her. She didn't flinch at the sight of the blood on his hands, nor did she cower beneath the dead, freezing look in his eyes that made other men weep. "You're tracking the streets onto my clean floors, Jin-ho," she said. Her voice was rich and smooth, carrying the faint, rhythmic cadence of New Orleans, cutting right through the ringing in his ears. Jin-ho stopped, looking down at his Italian leather shoes. "Apologies, Betty. Wash your hands." "The sink by the prep station," she ordered, tossing a handful of chopped scallions into the pan. A burst of steam rose, carrying the rich, savory aroma of braised short ribs and a spice blend she guarded like state secrets. "I don't serve men with dirt under their nails, and I certainly don't serve men with blood on their knuckles." He did as he was told. The untouchable boss of the White Tiger stripped off his tailored suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and scrubbed his hands under the scalding water. In this room, his title meant nothing. Here, he was just a hungry man, and she was the only one who could feed him. When he took his seat at the heavy wooden island, a steaming ceramic bowl was slid firmly in front of him. "Eat," Betty commanded softly, handing him a silver spoon. It was a rich, fiery stew, a masterful collision of Southern soul and Korean heat. Jin-ho took the first bite. The spice hit the back of his throat, blooming into a fierce, radiating warmth. It was brilliant, complex, and unashamedly aggressive. As the heat spread through his chest, the icy grip of the night finally began to recede. The screaming in his head lowered to a hum, then faded into silence. He closed his eyes, his rigid shoulders dropping an inch. Betty leaned against the counter opposite him, wiping her hands on a towel, her dark eyes watching him with a knowing, maternal strictness. She didn't ask who he had hurt tonight. She didn't ask what business had kept him out until 3 in the morning. She just watched the tension bleed out of his spine. "Better?" she asked, her tone softening just a fraction. Jin-ho opened his eyes. For the first time in 48 hours, they were clear. He looked at the fiery, no-nonsense woman who held the only key to his peace. Perfect, he murmured, taking another bite. As always. The storm that battered Seoul that Thursday night felt like a physical assault against the glass walls of Ryu Jinho's private study. Rain lashed at the reinforced panes in violent diagonal sheets, blurring the neon skyline into a smear of bleeding colors. Inside, the temperature was strictly regulated, the air filtered and perfectly still, but Jinho felt a coldness seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the weather. He sat perfectly rigid behind a massive desk, carved from a single slab of black walnut. The only light in the cavernous room came from the glow of his encrypted laptop screen, casting sharp, skeletal shadows across his pale, angular face. He had found the rot. For 3 weeks, there had been whispers, shipments of weapons intercepted at the Incheon port, safe houses raided by the police, mere hours before his men were supposed to arrive. Accounts frozen. The White Tiger Syndicate was a machine of terrifying precision, built on absolute loyalty and lethal consequences. A machine like that did not experience strings of bad luck. A machine like that only failed when someone on the inside started pulling the wires. Jinho stared at the digital dossier on his screen. The blinking cursor felt like a mocking heartbeat. The mole wasn't a low-level enforcer or a newly recruited runner. It was Choi, who had bled beside him in the back alleys of Busan when they were nothing but hungry street kids. Choi, who had helped him carve his empire out of the flesh of their enemies. Choi, who sat at his right hand during the Lunar New Year banquets. Jinho felt no rage at the betrayal, only a profound, suffocating exhaustion. In his world, loyalty was always rented, never owned. He knew what had to be done. Choi would disappear before the sun rose. There would be no trial, no opportunity for excuses, just a silent, efficient removal. That was the burden of the crown Jinho wore. But as his dark, dead eyes scanned the decrypted communications Choi had been feeding to the rival Red Crane triad, his breath caught in his throat. It was a physical snag, a sudden, sharp hitch in his chest that made his blood run backward. He leaned closer to the screen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the heavy desk. He read the lines again and again. Target is heavily guarded during transport, Choi's message read. Impenetrable during board meetings. But he has a blind spot. Midnight. Every night. He goes to the kitchens alone. He dismisses his personal detail. He sits with the American cook. She is the only one he listens to. She is his quiet place. Take her, and you break him. He will give up the ports for her. Jinho closed his eyes. The glowing text burned into the back of his eyelids. Take her, and you break him. A sickening lurch of pure, unadulterated terror twisted his gut. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in 15 years, not since he had taken his first life to survive. He was Ryu Jinho. He did not feel fear. He was the thing other men feared in the dark. But the thought of Mama Betty, with her crisp white aprons, her sharp, knowing eyes, and her hands that created the only comfort he had left in this brutal world, dragged into a Red Crane warehouse? The thought of her bleeding because of him? It was unacceptable. It was impossible. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair skidded backward, slamming into the mahogany bookshelves. He began to pace the length of the study, his strides long and predatory. He could double the guard around her. He could confine her to the penthouse. He could assign his most lethal men to shadow her every move. No, the cold, analytical part of his brain countered. A fortress is only a prison waiting to be breached. If the Red Cranes knew Betty was his weakness, they would not stop. They would send assassins disguised as delivery boys. They would poison the produce she ordered. They would bomb the entire west wing of the estate just to get to the kitchen. As long as the rival syndicates believed Mama Betty held favor in the eyes of the White Tiger, a target was painted on her back in glowing neon paint, And in the underworld, weaknesses were not simply exploited, they were butchered for sport. There was only one way to protect her. He had to erase the target. He had to make the underworld believe that Choi's intelligence was completely flawed. He had to prove, spectacularly and definitively, that Betty meant absolutely nothing to him. She could not be his sanctuary. She had to become his garbage. He had to cast her out with such viciousness, such public disdain, that the spies watching his estate would report back to the Red Cranes that the cook was just another disposable servant who had crossed the boss and been lucky to escape with her life. If he fired her gently, they would think it was a ruse to protect her. If he gave her a severance and put her on a plane, they would track the plane. He had to break her. He had to shatter her trust, trample on her pride, and terrify her so deeply that she would flee this house and this country, never looking back. She had to hate him. The realization felt like swallowing ground glass. Betty was the only person who looked at him and saw a man instead of a monster. She scolded him for tracking mud. She forced him to wash his hands. She fed him stews that tasted like sunlight and home, things he had never actually possessed, but somehow remembered when he ate her food. She was the one tether keeping him from descending entirely into the black, sociopathic void required to run his empire. If he pushed her away, he would be entirely alone in the dark. Jinho stopped pacing and turned toward the floor-to-ceiling window. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The rain was washing the city clean, but nothing could wash the blood and the filth from his own life. He was a creature of violence. She was a creator of warmth. They should never have occupied the same space to begin with. He had been selfish to keep her here, selfish to use her light to warm his own freezing soul. Now, the bill for that selfishness had come due. He glanced at the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the study. It was 11:45. In 15 minutes, the ritual would begin. She would be preparing his midnight tea. Chamomile, steeped exactly the way he needed it, perhaps with a touch of honey and a slice of fresh ginger to settle his ever-churning stomach. She would place it on the silver tray. She would walk up the private staircase. She would knock twice, firmly, never timidly, before entering. Jinho walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 3 fingers of Macallan. He didn't drink it. He just held the heavy glass, feeling its weight, letting the amber liquid catch the dim light. He needed to build the rage. He needed to manufacture a monster so terrifying that she would not try to argue, would not try to comfort him, but would only run. He thought of Choi. He thought of the guns on the docks. He took the stress, the betrayal, the paranoia of his daily existence, and he twisted it, wrapping it around his heart like barbed wire. He buried the boy who loved Betty's cooking and resurrected the boss of the White Tiger. He let his face go slack, his eyes deadening, until they resembled the flat, emotionless stare of a shark. He waited. The minutes dragged like hours. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock, the relentless drumming of the rain, and the slow, even draws of his own breath. At exactly midnight, a soft strip of light appeared beneath the heavy oak door of his study. Jinho's grip on the whiskey glass tightened until his knuckles ached. Do it, he told himself. Do it to save her life. 2 knocks, firm, unapologetic. Enter, Jinho said. His voice was a flat, cold rasp. The door swung open, and Mama Betty stepped into the dim room. She wore her usual immaculate white chef's coat, her dark hair pulled back neatly. In her hands, she carried a small silver tray holding a delicate porcelain teacup, a saucer, and a small folded linen napkin. The fragrant steam rising from the cup smelled of jasmine and honey. She paused just inside the threshold, her sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the darkness, the glow of the laptop, the rigid line of Jinho's shoulders. She was too observant. She knew instantly that the air in the room was wrong. It was thick, charged, and dangerous. "It's pitch black in here, Jin-Ho," she said, her rich New Orleans drawl attempting to cut through the heavy atmosphere. She walked toward his desk, her sensible shoes clicking against the hardwood. "You're going to ruin your eyes staring at that screen in the dark. I brought you something a little stronger tonight, jasmine and holy basil. You look like you haven't slept in a week." She reached out to set the tray on the edge of his desk. "Don't put that there," Jin-Ho snapped. The sharpness of his tone, like the crack of a whip, made her pause. The tray hovered an inch above the walnut surface. Betty looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. In the 5 years she had worked for him, he had never once raised his voice to her. He had been silent, he had been brooding, but he had always treated her with a quiet, reverent respect. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Are you deaf? Or just stupid?" Jin-Ho sneered. He forced the venom into his throat, pushing it out with every syllable. He stepped out from behind the desk, towering over her. "I said, do not put that garbage on my desk." Betty slowly straightened her back, pulling the tray closer to her chest. The maternal warmth in her eyes was flickering, replaced by a guarded wariness. "Jin-Ho, what is the matter with you? Have you been drinking?" She glanced at the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. "Whatever business is out there, you don't bring it in here. You don't talk to me like that." "I will talk to you however I damn well please," he said, stepping closer. He used his height, his physical presence, the sheer, intimidating aura that made hardened killers flinch. He loomed over her, a shadow of pure malice. "You forget your place, old woman. You are a cook, a servant. You chop vegetables. You wash pots. You do not dictate what I do, where I look, or how I speak." Betty blinked, a flash of genuine hurt crossing her flawless features before hardening into defensive anger. "My place? I feed you when you're too wrapped up in your own blood and mess to remember you're human. I keep you breathing. Don't you dare stand there and try to play the mob boss with me. I know you." "You don't," he thought desperately. "God, Betty, please just run." But he couldn't say that. The security cameras in the hallway were recording. The guards outside the door were listening. If he showed a crack of mercy, the Red Cranes would see it. "You know nothing," Jin-Ho hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. He set his whiskey glass down on the desk with a sharp clack. "You are an arrogant, overpaid employee who has gotten entirely too comfortable. I am tired of your mothering. I am tired of your insolence. And I am utterly disgusted by this swill." He lashed out, his hand moving with lightning speed. He slapped the silver tray. The impact was loud in the quiet room. The porcelain cup tumbled off the tray, spilling scalding hot tea over Betty's pristine white apron and onto the floor. Betty gasped, stepping back quickly as the hot liquid splashed against her shoes. She looked down at the mess, then up at him, her dark eyes wide with shock and a sudden, heartbreaking realization. The man standing in front of her was not the broken, exhausted soul she had fed in the kitchen 3 nights ago. This was the white tiger. This was the monster everyone whispered about. "Jin-Ho," she breathed, her voice trembling just slightly. The sound of his name on her lips, laced with fear, nearly broke him. His chest tightened so painfully, he thought his ribs might snap. He wanted to fall to his knees. He wanted to apologize, to wipe the tea from her apron, to beg for her forgiveness. He wanted to tell her about Choi, about the Red Cranes, about the target on her back. But he looked at the open door, at the darkness of the hallway where shadows listened. He grabbed the delicate porcelain saucer from the tilted tray still in her hands. He didn't just drop it, he threw it. "Leave!" he roared, shattering the porcelain cup against the wall. "Get out of my house and never come back." The echo of the shattering porcelain rang through the cavernous study, sharp and violent, competing with the relentless drumming of the storm against the reinforced glass. The delicate white fragments of the cup scattered across the dark walnut floor, like broken teeth, a pool of fragrant, amber tea seeping into the expensive Persian rug. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. The air in the room was pulled incredibly taut, vibrating with the sudden, ugly violence of Jin-Ho's outburst. Jin-Ho stood panting slightly, his chest rising and falling beneath his tailored waistcoat. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles white, his nails digging into his palms so hard they threatened to draw blood. He kept his face completely locked, a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He forced his dark eyes to remain dead, staring down at the woman who had been his only solace for 5 years. He prayed to whatever gods listened to monsters that she would run. He needed her to be terrified. He needed her to flee into the night, far away from the crosshairs that Choi had painted on her back. But Mama Betty did not scream. She did not flinch. She did not cower or shrink away from the terrifying boss of the White Tiger Syndicate. Instead, Betty looked at him. She looked right through the manufactured rage, right through the dead eyes, and saw the jagged, bleeding edges of a man who was breaking himself into pieces. She didn't know why he was doing it, but she was a woman who had lived a hard life long before she ever stepped foot in Seoul. She knew a performance when she saw one. She also knew that, performance or not, a line had just been crossed that could never, ever be uncrossed. Slowly, with an excruciating, deliberate calm, Betty reached behind her back. Jin-Ho's breath hitched in his throat. He watched, helpless and agonizingly silent, as her deft fingers found the knot of her crisp, pristine white apron. "You don't have to break your own china, Jin-Ho," Betty said. Her rich New Orleans drawl was perfectly steady, stripped of all its usual maternal warmth, leaving behind a cold, hard dignity that commanded the room. "And you don't have to yell. I hear you just fine." She untied the knot. She slipped the loop over her head, careful not to let the splashed tea stain her sensible blouse beneath. She folded the apron once over her arm, a gesture of absolute, ingrained professionalism, and walked over to his massive black walnut desk. She laid the folded white fabric on the corner of the wood. It looked like a flag of surrender, but it felt like a guillotine blade dropping on Jin-Ho's neck. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't ask for severance. She simply turned her back on the most dangerous man in South Korea and walked out of the study, her sensible shoes clicking a steady, unwavering rhythm down the hallway. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Jin-Ho collapsed into his leather chair. His rigid posture disintegrated. He brought his trembling hands up to his face, pressing the heels of his palms into his eyes until he saw stars. He had done it. He had saved her life. The spies would report back to the Red Cranes that the American cook had been violently dismissed, discarded like trash. The target on her back would vanish. But as the scent of spilled jasmine and honey filled the dark study, Jin-Ho felt a hollow, suffocating agony clawing at his insides. He had saved her, yes, but he had just condemned himself to a life entirely in the dark. Down the sweeping hall, in the private staff wing of the penthouse, Betty moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Her suite was luxurious, far grander than any apartment she had ever owned back in the States. Jin-Ho had insisted on it. He had filled it with Egyptian cotton sheets, a soaking tub, and a small, private kitchenette outfitted with top-of-the-line appliances. Now she looked at the opulence with nothing but a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She pulled a heavy canvas duffel bag from the top of her closet and threw it onto the king-sized bed. She did not cry. Betty was not a woman who wasted tears on men who threw tantrums. Her heart hurt, a deep, aching throb in the center of her chest, because she had loved that broken, quiet boy who sat at her kitchen island and ate her stew like it was Holy Communion. She had thought she was healing him. She had thought she was bringing light into a space that desperately needed it. Foolish, she reprimanded herself, sliding open her dresser drawers. You thought you could mother a viper and not get bit. She packed only what belonged to her. She left the silk blouses Jin-ho had ordered for her from Milan. She left the diamond tennis bracelet he had awkwardly handed her last Christmas, staring at the floor while he mumbled a thank you for a year of good meals. She packed her comfortable slacks, her thick sweaters, her sturdy shoes. Then, she walked to the kitchenette. This was the most important part. She pulled a worn, rolled leather case from the drawer. She unrolled it on the counter, revealing a gleaming set of carbon steel Wusthof knives. These knives had traveled with her from New Orleans to New York, and finally to Seoul. They were an extension of her own hands. She carefully wiped down her favorite 8-inch chef's knife. As she held the heavy handle, an unbidden memory flashed behind her eyes. Jin-ho, standing awkwardly beside her prep station at 2 in the morning, asking in a quiet, hesitant voice how to julienne a carrot. She had stood behind him, guiding his large, scarred, lethal hands, teaching him a grip that wouldn't slip. For a fleeting hour, he hadn't been a mafia boss. He had just been a student. Betty forced the memory away, snapping the leather roll shut with a sharp, decisive crack. She shoved the knives into the duffel bag and zipped it closed. She slung the heavy strap over her shoulder and took one last look at the room. It was spotless. It was as if she had never been there at all. With her chin held high and her spine straight as a steel rod, Mama Betty walked out of her suite and headed for the grand staircase. Back in his study, Jin-ho was watching the security monitors. The glowing screens illuminated his pale face in the darkened room. He watched her figure, a small, dignified silhouette carrying a heavy bag, moving down the sweeping marble staircase toward the grand foyer. Every step she took felt like a physical blow to his ribs. He watched the guards stationed at the base of the stairs step back, averting their eyes. They knew better than to look at a disgraced servant, especially one who had just faced the wrath of the boss. Jin-ho's hand hovered over the intercom button. It would be so easy to press it, so easy to order the guards to stop her, to lock the doors, to bring her back up to him so he could fall on his knees and explain everything. But he forced his hand away. He looked at the encrypted file still open on his laptop. Take her, and you break him. Keep walking, Betty, he prayed silently, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his sternum. Walk out the door. Get in the car I arranged. Go to the airport. Live. Betty reached the expansive ground floor foyer. The space was a monument to cold, modern wealth. Acres of white marble, soaring 30-foot ceilings, and a massive chandelier of shattered glass that hung like a frozen explosion overhead. The storm raged outside, the heavy rain battering the massive double front doors of reinforced bulletproof glass. The mansion was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the squeak of Betty's rubber-soled shoes against the polished marble. She walked past the security desk. The 2 guards stationed there kept their faces perfectly blank, staring straight ahead as she passed. She reached the massive front doors. Through the thick glass, she could see the headlights of a black sedan waiting idly in the circular driveway, the rain slicking over its dark paint. Her ride to the airport, her ticket out of this underworld nightmare. Betty reached out, her hand wrapping around the heavy, cold brass doorknob. She took a deep breath, preparing to turn it, preparing to step out into the storm and leave Ryu Jin-ho behind forever. Upstairs, Jin-ho watched her hand grip the brass on the monitor. A strange, twisted sense of relief began to wash over him. She was safe. She was leaving. The plan had worked. And then, the lights went out. The entire mansion plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The monitors in Jin-Ho's study died instantly. The rhythmic hum of the air conditioning ground to a halt. For a split second, the only sound in the world was the violent howling of the storm outside. Then came the breach. It didn't sound like breaking glass. The reinforced panes of the front doors were designed to withstand heavy ballistics. Instead, it sounded like a bomb going off. A shaped charge, planted perfectly on the hinges of the massive double doors, detonated with a deafening concussive boom that shook the foundation of the estate. Betty was thrown backward by the sheer force of the blast wave. The heavy brass doorknob was ripped from her grip as the massive doors blew inward, tearing off their hinges and slamming violently onto the marble floor. Smoke and the sharp, acrid stench of C4 filled the foyer, mixing instantly with the freezing wind and rain that came howling through the gaping hole in the mansion's defenses. Betty hit the floor hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Her duffel bag skidded across the slick marble. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine, her vision blurring as dust and smoke swirled around her in the darkness. Upstairs, the explosion snapped Jin-Ho's shock into pure, lethal adrenaline. Choi hadn't just leaked her vulnerability. Choi had leaked the security codes. He had disabled the backup generators. The Red Cranes hadn't waited for Betty to be cast out. They had timed their strike for the exact moment the shift changed, knowing she would be caught in the open. "Betty!" Jin-Ho roared. The sound tore from his throat, completely unhinged, stripping away every ounce of the cold, calculating mafia boss he had pretended to be minutes earlier. He didn't wait for his security detail. He drew the heavy, matte black Glock 19 from his shoulder holster and sprinted out of the study, taking the grand staircase 3 steps at a time in the pitch black. Down below, the shadows were moving. Through the smoke and the driving rain, Betty saw them. Tactical boots stepping over the ruined front doors. Suppressed submachine guns sweeping the foyer. They were dressed in head-to-toe black combat gear, moving with the terrifying, silent coordination of professional hit squads. The Red Crane assassins had arrived. The 2 guards at the security desk didn't even have time to draw their weapons. 2 sharp, muted thwips echoed through the foyer, and both men dropped to the floor, lifeless before they hit the marble. Betty scrambled backward, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was a chef, not a soldier, but the survival instincts forged in the rougher neighborhoods of New Orleans kicked in. She rolled behind a massive, decorative marble pillar just as a line of suppressed gunfire chewed through the drywall where she had been lying a second before. "Betty, down!" The voice boomed from the darkness above. Jin-Ho hit the landing of the grand staircase, his weapon already raised. He didn't bother looking for cover. He became a force of pure, devastating violence. He fired 3 times in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face in staccato bursts of orange light. 2 of the assassins in the doorway dropped instantly, their body armor useless against Jin-Ho's perfect, lethal aim at their exposed throats. The remaining assassins scattered, diving behind overturned furniture and the security desk, turning their weapons upward toward the staircase. "Jin-Ho, get back!" Betty screamed over the sound of gunfire tearing chunks out of the marble banister. But he didn't retreat. He was descending, moving fast, his eyes scanning the darkness with the predatory focus of a tiger protecting its own. He fired again, pinning down a shooter behind the desk. He was a one-man army, a demon of the underworld unleashed, drawing every ounce of fire away from the pillar where Betty hid. He reached the ground floor, moving with terrifying speed across the open expanse of the foyer, his sole objective to reach her, to put his body between her and the door. "I'm here," he yelled, sliding behind the pillar next to her. He was breathing hard, the smell of gunpowder clinging to his clothes. He reached out in the dark, his large hand gripping her shoulder with a frantic, desperate strength. "Are you hurt? Did they hit you?" "I'm fine," Betty gasped, her hands shaking as she clutched the lapels of her blouse. She looked at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. The cold, cruel man who had shattered her teacup was completely gone. In his place was a frantic, terrified protector, his eyes wide and wild with fear for her safety. "Jin-ho, what is this?" "I tried to send you away," he gritted out, popping the empty magazine from his Glock and slamming a fresh one home with a sharp click. "I tried to get you out before they came. I'm sorry. God, Betty, I am so sorry." Before she could process the admission, the world exploded again. A flash of lightning illuminated the shattered doorway, revealing a figure stepping out of the tree line on the edge of the estate. The figure wasn't carrying a submachine gun. They were holding a long, heavy sniper rifle, the scope glinting menacingly in the rain. The sniper wasn't aiming at Jin-ho. The laser sight cut through the smoke, a tiny, lethal red dot settling perfectly on the center of Betty's white blouse. Jin-ho saw the red dot. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds. He simply threw himself forward. He tackled Betty, his massive frame covering hers entirely, driving her hard to the marble floor just as the sniper pulled the trigger. The sound of the high-caliber rifle was deafening, a supersonic crack that seemed to split the very air in the room. The bullet didn't hit Betty. It caught Jin-ho squarely in the back of his right shoulder, just below his collarbone. The kinetic energy of the round was devastating. It tore through his tailored suit, shattering bone, shredding muscle, and exiting out his chest in an explosive spray of crimson. The impact lifted his body inches off the ground before dropping him violently onto the unforgiving marble. "Jin-ho!" Betty screamed, the sound tearing from her throat in a ragged, horrified shriek. Jin-ho hit the floor and rolled, his gun skittering away into the darkness. A sickening, wet gasp tore from his lips. The pain was instantaneous and absolute, a blinding, white-hot agony that stole the breath from his lungs and turned his vision gray. Blood immediately began to pool beneath him, stark and terrifyingly bright against the pristine white marble. His men were arriving now. The backup generators finally kicked in, flooding the ruined foyer with harsh, emergency lighting. Shouts filled the air as the White Tiger enforcers swarmed into the room, their weapons chattering as they laid down a relentless wall of suppressive fire, driving the remaining Red Crane assassins back into the storm. But Jin-ho didn't care about the battle anymore. He didn't care about his empire, his territory, or his pride. He lay on his back, staring up at the shattered chandelier. His breathing was wet and shallow, bubbling in his throat. He could feel the coldness of the floor seeping into his bones, rushing up to meet him. The mask he had worn for 15 years, the untouchable, emotionless phantom of soul, completely and utterly shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, bleeding man. Betty was on her knees beside him in an instant. Her professional calm was gone. Her hands were covered in his blood as she pressed her folded white apron, the same apron he had forced her to take off, hard against the gaping exit wound on his chest. "Look at me," she ordered, her voice cracking, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes and mixing with the rain on his face. "Read you, Jin-ho. You look at me. You are not dying on my floor today." Jin-ho tried to speak, but only a choked, bloody cough escaped his lips. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning black. He could feel himself slipping away, falling into the dark void he had always known was waiting for him. But as he fell, he felt her warmth, her hands, pressing desperately against his chest, her tears falling on his cheek. With the last ounce of strength he possessed, Jin-ho dragged his left arm across the blood-slicked marble. His fingers, trembling and stained crimson, found the hem of her slacks. He wrapped his hand around her ankle, gripping her with a desperate, crushing intensity. It was the grip of a drowning man clinging to his only lifeline. He looked up at her, his dark eyes entirely bare, entirely broken. There was no pride left. There was no boss. There was only a desperate plea from a soul terrified of dying alone. "Betty," he gasped, the word coming out in a bloody, jagged whisper. "Please, stay. Save me." The chaos of the foyer, the deafening rattle of automatic weapons, the acrid stench of C4, the shouts of his enforcers pushing back the Red Crane assassins, faded into a dull, echoing roar in Ryu Jinho's ears. His world had violently narrowed to the agonizing, white-hot fire burning through his right shoulder and the warm, blood-slicked hand holding onto his wrist. He was dying. He knew what a mortal wound felt like. He had inflicted enough of them to recognize the sudden, catastrophic drop in blood pressure, the creeping gray fog eating away at the edges of his vision, the terrible bubbling wetness in his lungs. He had gripped her ankle like a terrified child. "Save me." He expected her to scream for his men. He expected her to weep, to panic, to freeze in the face of the horrific violence that had just ruptured her quiet world. He expected the maternal, warm-hearted chef he had brought into his home to shatter under the weight of a mafia war. She did not. Instead of screaming, Betty moved, and she moved with a terrifying, calculated speed that made Jinho's fading brain stutter in confusion. "Let go of my ankle, Jinho, and use that hand to press this down," Betty ordered. Her voice cut through the gunfire like a surgical blade. The rich, slow cadence of her New Orleans drawl was completely gone. In its place was a clipped, hard, authoritative bark that demanded absolute obedience. She took his left hand, the one that wasn't paralyzed by the bullet tearing through his right side, and forced it down onto the ruined mass of his shoulder. She shoved the wadded-up fabric of her white apron directly into the crater of his flesh. "Harder," she snapped, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, cold light. "You want to bleed out on this marble? Put your weight into it." Jinho grunted, the pain forcing a sickening wave of nausea up his throat, but he did as he was told. He pressed down. "Choi!" Betty roared over her shoulder, not flinching, as a stray bullet shattered a marble vase 10 feet away. "Covering fire! Keep them pinned at the door!" "We are moving." Jinho blinked, his vision swimming. How does she know standard tactical commands? Before he could process the thought, Betty was hauling him up. She didn't possess the sheer physical bulk of his bodyguards, but she had a wiry, functional strength that defied logic. She grabbed him by the belt and the uninjured side of his collar, hooking her shoulder deep under his left armpit. She leveraged his weight against her hip, using her core to drag him off the floor. "Up, boss. On your feet. Do not make me carry dead weight," she gritted out, her breathing heavy but controlled. Jinho stumbled, his Italian leather shoes slipping on his own blood. A blinding flash of agony radiated from his collarbone, stealing the air from his lungs. He leaned heavily into her, his head lolling against her neck. She smelled of jasmine tea, gunpowder, and an absolute, unshakable resolve. "Where?" Jinho managed to gasp, a thin trail of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. "Safe room. Upstairs." "We'd never make the stairs," Betty fired back, practically carrying him down the darkened secondary hallway that led away from the foyer. "Pantry. Walk-in freezer. Now move your feet, Jinho. 1, 2, 1, 2. She was marching him. She was pacing his steps, keeping him conscious through sheer, aggressive force of will. They stumbled through the swinging doors of the massive industrial kitchen. The room was dark, lit only by the strobe light flashes of the storm raging outside the windows. The sanctuary where he had eaten his stews just days ago was now a shadowy obstacle course. Jinho's knees buckled. He was losing too much blood. The world tilted violently on its axis, and he felt himself crashing toward the heavy copper prep tables. Betty caught him. She braced her legs, taking the full brunt of his falling weight, and slammed him against the stainless steel door of the walk-in freezer. "Code," she demanded, her face inches from his. Her dark eyes were entirely devoid of fear. They were scanning him, evaluating his pupil dilation, assessing the color of his lips. It was a clinical, predatory gaze. 0, 4. Jin-ho choked, his head drooping. Betty slapped his cheek, hard. The sharp sting forced his eyes open. "Code!" she barked. "I know this freezer has a false back. I've seen the reinforced hinges. Give me the damn code before you bleed out on my clean floors." 042988, he whispered, his chin hitting his chest. Betty punched the numbers into the biometric keypad hidden beneath the temperature gauge. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed through the dark kitchen as the entire back wall of the freezer disengaged, revealing a thick steel door. She shoved it open, dragged Jin-ho inside, and slammed her hand on the internal lockdown button. The heavy steel bolts slammed into place with a definitive, tomb-like thud. The panic room was instantly flooded with harsh, stark white fluorescent light. The sudden silence was absolute, cutting off the sounds of the storm and the gunfire entirely. They were encased in impenetrable steel, buried in the heart of the mansion. Betty didn't waste a single second admiring the security. She dragged him toward the center of the room, where a pristine stainless steel medical table sat beneath a halo of surgical lights. Jin-ho's operation was vast. His safe rooms were equipped for urban warfare, stocked with trauma kits and emergency surgical supplies. She hoisted him onto the table. Jin-ho lay flat, staring up at the blinding lights, his chest heaving as he fought for every ragged breath. The pain was no longer localized to his shoulder. It was a living, breathing creature chewing on his spine. "Listen to me," Betty said, her face suddenly blocking the light. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the medical tray beside the table. "The bullet fragmented on your clavicle. A piece tore through the front, but the main slug deflected inward. It's lodged deep in your pectoral muscle, resting against the rib. If it shifts, it punctures the lung. I have to get it out." Jin-ho stared at her, his mind struggling to bridge the impossible gap in logic. This was Mama Betty. She baked bread. She made reductions. She didn't know the difference between a fragmented slug and a clean exit wound. "You gay," Jin-ho gasped, coughing violently. "You are a cook. Right now, I am the only thing keeping you on this side of hell," Betty said, her voice ice cold. She took the heavy trauma shears and drove the blunt end under the collar of his ruined, bespoke suit jacket. With 3 swift, brutal snips, she cut the jacket, the waistcoat, and the silk shirt completely off his body, tossing the blood-soaked ruin onto the floor. She worked with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. She didn't fumble with the sterile packaging of the medical supplies. She didn't hesitate at the sight of his torn, mangled flesh. She moved around the surgical tray with the exact same fluid, aggressive confidence she used when commanding her kitchen. Jin-ho watched her through slitted, pain-filled eyes. The realization hit him like a second bullet. She wasn't panicking because this wasn't new to her. The blood, the trauma, the violent ticking clock of a fading pulse. She had lived here before. "I don't have time to administer a general anesthetic, and your blood pressure is too low for me to risk putting you under anyway," Betty said, tearing open a bottle of betadine. "I'm going to hit the local area with lidocaine, but you are going to feel the pressure, and you are going to feel the extraction. Do you understand me?" Jin-ho nodded once, a jerky, rigid movement. "Good." She poured the dark brown betadine directly into the open, ragged crater in his chest. Jin-ho roared. his back arching off the steel table as the antiseptic burned into his raw nerves like liquid fire. His good hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the table so hard his knuckles popped. "Breathe," Betty commanded, plunging a needle into the unbroken skin around the wound, injecting the local anesthetic in 4 quick, precise bursts. "Don't hold your breath, Jin-ho. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Keep your heart rate steady. I will not have you going into cardiac arrest on my table." My table. The possessiveness, the absolute authority in her voice, anchored him. He forced his eyes open, forcing himself to look at her. She had pulled a pair of sterile blue latex gloves over her hands. She picked up a gleaming silver scalpel and a pair of heavy forceps. Her face was set in lines of grim, stony concentration. There was no warmth, no gentle mothering. She was a soldier standing over a casualty. "Stay with me," she ordered, meeting his gaze. "Look right at me." She pressed the scalpel into his chest. Jin-ho bit down on his own lip so hard he tasted copper. The lidocaine numbed the surface, but as Betty dug deeper, following the destructive path of the bullet into the thick muscle of his chest, the pressure was agonizing. It felt like a hot iron rod was being driven between his ribs. He locked his eyes onto hers. It was the only way to survive the pain. He studied the sharp line of her jaw, the slight flare of her nostrils, the total absence of trembling in her hands. "You've done this," he choked out, his voice a ragged whisper, his body shaking uncontrollably with the shock of the trauma. Betty didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the bloody cavern she was navigating. "Keep talking. Tell me about the mole. Tell me how they got in." "Choi," Jin-ho hissed, his head thrashing side to side as a fresh wave of agony ripped through him. She had hit something deep. He sold the codes. Sold you. He told them you were my weakness. Betty's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Her dark eyes flicked up to his pale, sweating face. A complex emotion flashed in the depths of her gaze. Anger, sorrow, and a sudden, sharp understanding. "That's why you threw the tea," she said quietly, her voice dropping its harsh edge for just a moment. "That's why you put on that show in the study. You were trying to fire me so I wouldn't be a target." "I tried to make them think you meant nothing to me," he gasped, his chest heaving under her hands. "You're a fool, Ryu Jin-ho," she muttered, returning to her work. But her touch, just for a moment, was infinitely more careful. "A noble, stupid fool. Hold still. I have it." She slid the heavy metal forceps deep into the wound. Jin-ho felt a sickening scrape of metal against bone. He groaned, a deep, guttural sound of pure animal suffering, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Eyes on me," Betty snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "Do not pass out. Look at me." He forced his gaze back to her face, fighting the darkness. With a sickening, wet suction sound, Betty pulled her hand back. Clasped tightly in the jaws of the forceps was a mangled, bloody piece of lead, the flattened, twisted remains of a high-caliber sniper round. She dropped it into a metal kidney dish with a sharp, heavy clink. "Got the bastard," she breathed, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. The immediate, blinding pressure in his chest vanished, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. Jin-ho went limp against the steel table, his entire body soaked in cold sweat. He felt as though he had run a marathon through broken glass. But it wasn't over. Betty immediately moved to stop the bleeding. She grabbed a specialized cauterizing pen from the surgical tray. "This is going to smell bad," she warned him flatly. "Brace yourself." The acrid smell of burning flesh filled the sterile air of the panic room as she expertly sealed the ruptured blood vessels. Jin-ho gritted his teeth, his vision swimming, but he didn't look away from her. He watched her hands. They moved with the grace of a seasoned artist, tying off sutures, packing the wound with hemostatic gauze, and finally, stitching the ragged edges of his skin together with swift, perfectly spaced knots. She was faster than the private surgeon on the syndicate's payroll. She was cleaner. She was infinitely more dangerous. When she finally taped a thick, sterile bandage over his chest and shoulder, she stepped back from the table. She stripped the bloody blue latex gloves off her hands, throwing them into a biohazard bin. She leaned over the stainless steel sink in the corner of the room, turning on the water and splashing her face, washing away the sweat and the sheer exhaustion of the adrenaline crash. Jin-ho lay on the table, his breathing finally stabilizing, the violent drumming of his heart slowing to a steady, rhythmic beat. The painkillers in the local anesthetic were beginning to spread, dulling the agony to a manageable throb. He looked at the woman leaning against the sink. The crisp white chef's blouse she wore was ruined, stained with his blood and sweat. Her hair had fallen out of its neat bun, hanging in loose, dark strands around her face. She wasn't his cook anymore. The illusion was entirely shattered. The comforting, maternal tapestry she had woven around herself in his kitchen had burned away in the fire of the ambush, leaving behind raw, hardened steel. "Who are you?" Jin-ho asked. His voice was hoarse, raspy from screaming, but the demand in it was absolute. Betty turned off the water. She grabbed a clean towel and slowly dried her face. She didn't look at him immediately. She stared at the blank steel wall of the panic room, as if seeing ghosts projected on its surface. "My name is Betty," she said softly, tossing the towel onto the counter. That part wasn't a lie. A chef does not know how to extract a deflected sniper round under fire without blinking, Jin-ho said, painfully propping himself up on his good elbow. His dark eyes, usually cold and dead, were burning with intense, piercing focus. A chef does not command covering fire. A chef does not stitch flesh faster than a trauma surgeon. "Who are you?" Betty turned to face him. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. The maternal warmth was gone from her eyes. In its place was a flat, cold, heavy exhaustion, the look of a veteran who had seen too many bodies and dug too many graves. "Before I came to New York," Betty began, her voice low and even, "I lived in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. Things were complicated. The police didn't come to our neighborhood unless they were looking to put somebody in a bag. And the boys who ran the streets, the ones who protected the neighborhood, they couldn't go to hospitals when things went bad." Jin-ho watched her, silent, absorbing every word. "I was 19 when I learned how to dig a bullet out of a boy's leg using a paring knife and half a bottle of bourbon," she continued, her eyes distant. "Word got around. By the time I was 25, I wasn't just patching up neighborhood kids. I was the primary medic for the largest cartel running the Gulf Coast." Jin-ho's breath hitched. The Gulf Coast syndicates were notoriously brutal, built on a level of savage violence that rivaled even the most ruthless Asian triads. "They called me the Mender," Betty said, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corner of her lips. "I spent 10 years in basements, safe houses, and abandoned warehouses, up to my elbows in the blood of hitters, enforcers, and bosses. I treated gunshot wounds, knife lacerations, explosive trauma, and torture victims. I kept monsters breathing so they could go back out and make more monsters." She pushed away from the counter and walked slowly toward the operating table, stopping just inches from where he lay. "I made a lot of money, Jin-ho," she said softly, staring down into his eyes, "and I lost every single piece of my soul. I woke up one morning and realized that the blood on my hands was never going to wash off. I was just as guilty as the men pulling the triggers. So I walked. I changed my name, I moved to New York, and I took the one thing I actually loved doing, cooking, and I hid behind it." She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the edge of the crisp white bandage strapped across his chest. I built a sanctuary, she whispered. I swore I would never pick up a scalpel again. I swore I would only create things that nourished people, instead of fixing the things that destroyed them. And then, you brought me here. Jinho stared at her, utterly captivated, completely devastated. He had hired her to be his peace, his escape from the violent underworld he ruled. But she wasn't an escape. She was a mirror. You knew what I was, Jinho said, his voice a low, rough rumble in the quiet room. You knew who I was, the White Tiger. You knew I was a killer. Why did you stay? Betty looked down at him, her dark eyes entirely bare, entirely honest. Because I know what the dark looks like, Jinho. I know what it does to a man. When you sat in my kitchen, you weren't a boss. You were just a ghost, starving for something real. I thought, maybe if I fed you, maybe if I gave you a safe place to land, I could save one soul. Maybe it would make up for all the ones I helped send to the grave. She let out a long, ragged sigh, a sound of profound defeat. But you can't outrun the life, she said, gesturing to his bloody chest, to the steel walls encasing them, to the war raging outside. The violence always catches up. I should have known better. Jinho reached out with his uninjured left hand. He didn't grab her ankle in desperation this time. He reached up, his large, scarred fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. Betty froze, looking down at his hand holding hers. You didn't fail, Betty, Jinho said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. The dynamic in the room shifted, locking into a new, profound alignment. The untouchable boss and the subservient cook were dead, blown apart by the explosion in the foyer. In their place were two veterans of the same brutal war, two survivors who understood the true weight of blood and loyalty. You saved me, he told her, his grip tightening just a fraction, a promise and a vow. Not just tonight on this table. Every night in that kitchen, you are the only thing that kept the monster from consuming me entirely. He slowly pulled her hand down, pressing her palm flat against his chest, right over his beating heart, just above the bandage she had sewn. I am not your boss anymore, Jinho swore softly, the words sealing a pact in the sterile, blood-stained air of the panic room. And you are not my cook. We are the same, Betty. You understand the dark, and I swear to you, on my life, I will protect your light. Betty looked at the terrifying, lethal man lying broken on her table. She felt the strong, steady rhythm of his heart beating against her palm, a heart she had just kept from stopping. The fear and the exhaustion melted away, replaced by a deep, resonant understanding. She had run from the underworld for years, but looking into Ryu Jinho's eyes, she finally realized she had stopped running. She gave him a slow, grim nod, her jaw setting in a line of hardened steel. Good, she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly back into the cold, commanding tone of the cartel medic who feared no man. Because when your men clear this house, we have a mole to hunt. And I want the first piece of the bastard who ruined my kitchen. Jinho's lips curled into a slow, dark, beautiful smile. We will cut him to pieces, Jinho promised. The heavy, hydraulic hum of the panic room's ventilation system was the only sound left in the world. Outside these thick steel walls, a war was raging through the halls of Ryu Jinho's mansion. But inside the stark, blindingly bright medical bunker, time had simply stopped. Betty's hand was still pressed flat against Jinho's chest, her palm resting directly over his furiously beating heart. The pristine white bandage beneath her fingers was stark against his scarred golden skin. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the vital, undeniable proof that she had pulled him back from the absolute brink. Jinho stared up at her. His dark eyes, usually unfathomable pools of frozen ink, were entirely stripped of their defenses. They were wide, raw, and burning with an intensity that made the breath catch in Betty's throat. He wasn't looking at her the way a boss looks at an employee, or even the way a man looks at a savior. He was looking at her the way a starving man looks at a feast. The adrenaline that had fueled the surgery, the frantic, icy, clinical focus required to dig a bullet out of a man's chest while a hit squad battered at the doors, was beginning to crash. But it wasn't fading into exhaustion. It was transmuting. The sheer, violent terror of almost losing him was combusting into something else entirely. It was morphing into a primal, desperate need to affirm that they were both still breathing, still alive, still here. "Betty," Jin-Ho whispered, his voice a raspy, gravel-rough scrape that sent a shiver straight down her spine. He didn't wait for her to answer. The hand that had been gently wrapped around her wrist suddenly tightened. With a surge of strength that defied the catastrophic trauma his body had just endured, Jin-Ho pulled her down. Betty didn't resist. She couldn't have resisted if she tried. The gravity between them, suppressed for 5 long years beneath polite nods, quiet midnights, and the strict boundaries of their roles, finally snapped. She collapsed against his uninjured side, her hands instantly finding the hard, corded muscles of his neck and jaw. When their lips met, there was no gentle, tentative exploration. There was no hesitation. It was a violent collision. It was teeth and heat and the desperate, bruising pressure of two people who had spent too long living in the dark. Jin-Ho groaned against her mouth, a deep, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated need. He tasted like copper and expensive whiskey. She tasted like adrenaline and the sweet, lingering ghost of jasmine tea. His good arm wrapped entirely around her waist, crushing her against his side, holding her as if he were afraid she might evaporate into the sterile air of the panic room. Betty kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own, her fingers tangled in his dark, sweat-dampened hair, anchoring him to her. All the years she had spent carefully guarding her heart, wrapping herself in the maternal armor of Mama Betty the chef, burned away in the furnace of his touch. She wasn't a cook right now. She was a woman who had just fought death for the man she loved, and won. "You're hurt," she breathed against his lips, forcing herself to pull back a fraction of an inch, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. "Jin-Ho, your shoulder." "I don't care," he growled fiercely, surging upward to capture her mouth again. He kissed her jaw, her neck, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. Every touch of his lips sent a shockwave of electricity through her nervous system. "I don't care about the shoulder. I don't care about the blood. Just let me feel you. Let me know you're real." The sheer vulnerability of the terrifying white tiger pleading for her warmth broke whatever remaining restraints Betty possessed. She straddled the edge of the steel medical table, being excruciatingly careful not to put pressure on his right side, and leaned over him entirely. Her hands mapped the broad expanse of his chest, sliding over the old scars that littered his skin, silent testaments to a lifetime of violence, before returning to frame his face. The passion between them was explosive, fueled by the intoxicating high of survival. It was rough and messy, stripped of all romance and replaced by something far more urgent and necessary. Jin-Ho's hand slid up her back, gripping the ruined, blood-stained fabric of her blouse, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her deeply, hungrily, drinking from her like a man dying of thirst. Betty met his fire with her own, her tongue sweeping into his mouth, matching his desperate rhythm. In the sterile, cold environment of the bunker, their heat was a blazing inferno. They were two hardened veterans of the underworld, two souls who understood the absolute fragility of life, clinging to each other in the eye of a hurricane. But the underworld never allowed for long reprieves. Just as Jin-Ho's hand swept down to grip the curve of her hip, pulling her impossibly closer, a sound shattered the heavy air of the panic room. Thud. It wasn't the distant rattle of gunfire. It was a massive, concussive impact against the reinforced steel door of the bunker. The heavy metal walls vibrated violently, knocking a tray of surgical instruments off the counter with a loud, clattering crash. Jinho and Betty froze, their lips barely an inch apart, their breathing ragged and heavy. Thud, thud. The impacts were rhythmic, heavy, and terrifyingly close. Instantly, the blinding fog of passion evaporated, replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of imminent combat. The lovers vanished, the soldiers returned. Betty pushed off the table, her boots hitting the steel floor with a solid thud. She didn't panic, she didn't scream. She simply turned her dark, calculating eyes toward the massive steel door. "They breached the kitchen," she stated, her voice dropping back into the cold, clinical cadence of the cartel medic. "They brought heavy ordnance," Jinho said. He gritted his teeth, throwing his legs over the side of the medical table. His face went instantly pale as the movement pulled at his freshly stitched chest, but he forced himself to stand. He swayed dangerously for a second, but locked his knees, refusing to fall. His eyes, seconds ago filled with raw desire, were now flat, dead, and entirely lethal. That's not C4. That's a hydraulic ram. A high-pitched, screaming hiss suddenly cut through the air. A thin line of blinding, white-hot light appeared horizontally across the center of the heavy steel door. "Thermite," Betty corrected grimly. "They're cutting the locking bolts. They know exactly how this door is constructed." "Choi gave them the blueprints," Jinho snarled, his left hand balling into a fist. "They aren't just here to kill me. They're here to make sure there's nothing left of the White Tiger." "Then we're going to disappoint them," Betty said. She turned away from the door and marched to the back wall of the panic room. She didn't ask if he had a weapons cache. A man like Jinho didn't build a bunker without teeth. She ran her hands along the seamless steel paneling until she found the hidden biometric scanner. "Thumbprint," she ordered, looking back at him. Jinho limped heavily across the room, leaving a bloody handprint on the medical table as he pushed off it. He pressed his left thumb to the glass. The wall slid open, revealing an armory that would rival a military staging ground. Assault rifles, tactical shotguns, body armor, and rows of pristine, fully loaded magazines gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Armor first," Betty commanded. She grabbed a lightweight Kevlar vest and tossed it to him. Jinho caught it with his left hand. "I can't get it over my right shoulder without tearing the stitches," he said flatly. "Then you fight without it." "Stay behind me," Betty replied, already strapping a heavily plated tactical rig over her ruined, blood-soaked blouse. She didn't look like a chef anymore. Covered in blood, strapped in black Kevlar, her face set in lines of absolute stone, she looked like the Grim Reaper. She bypassed the heavy assault rifles, too cumbersome for the tight quarters of the panic room, and grabbed a compact Heckler & Koch MP7 submachine gun. She slammed a magazine into the grip, racked the charging handle with a sharp, metallic clack, and slung it tight across her chest. From the bottom rack, she pulled a sleek, matte black combat knife with a serrated spine, slipping it into a sheath on her thigh. Jinho watched her, a dark thrill of awe cutting through his physical agony. She was magnificent. She was terrifying. He reached into the cache with his good hand and pulled out two modified Sig Sauer P226 handguns. He couldn't use his right arm to aim, but he tucked one gun into his waistband as a backup and gripped the other tightly in his left. He checked the chamber, his face a mask of cold, promised violence. The hissing at the door reached a deafening pitch. The white-hot line of thermite had completed its square around the primary locking mechanism. The steel was glowing an angry, molten orange. "They're going to kick it in," Betty said, moving to the left side of the doorway, pressing her back flat against the wall, her MP7 raised and ready. They'll throw a flashbang first to blind us, then flood the room. They don't know the layout of the bunker, Jin-ho said, taking up a position behind the heavy steel operating table, using it as cover. He rested his left forearm on the bloody surface, aiming the SIG directly at the center of the glowing door. We funnel them in. We create a choke point. On my mark, Betty breathed. The hissing stopped. For one agonizing heartbeat, there was utter silence. Then, the center of the heavy steel door exploded inward. A massive slab of molten metal slammed onto the floor of the panic room, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Immediately, a small cylindrical canister bounced through the smoking hole. "Flash!" Betty yelled, throwing her free arm over her eyes and turning her face to the wall. Jin-ho ducked behind the surgical table. The flashbang detonated with a blinding, terrifyingly bright burst of light and a concussive boom that rattled Jin-ho's teeth. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, the shadows moved. 4 heavily armed Red Crane enforcers poured through the breach, their suppressed weapons raised, sweeping the room. But they expected to find a bleeding boss and a terrified, cowering cook. They expected an execution, not a war. Betty didn't give them a second to adjust to the light. She stepped out from the wall, moving with the fluid, devastating grace of a striking viper. She didn't spray and pray. Her bursts were controlled, lethal, and devastatingly accurate. 3 sharp coughs from the MP7 echoed in the room. The first enforcer's head snapped back, his tactical helmet no match for the armor-piercing rounds at point-blank range. He dropped instantly. The second enforcer pivoted toward her, but Jin-ho was already firing from behind the table. Despite using his offhand, his aim was flawless. 2 hollow-point rounds took the man directly in the throat, sending him crashing backward into the smoking doorway. The third and fourth men realized the trap and dove for cover behind the overturned medical trays and supply cabinets. "Suppressing!" Betty barked, laying down a heavy barrage of fire that chewed the cabinets to splinters, keeping the enforcers pinned down. Jin-ho used the distraction. He stood up from the table, ignoring the blinding spike of agony from his chest, and walked deliberately forward. He was the White Tiger. He did not hide in his own house. He stepped around the table, leveled his SIG, and executed the third man with a single shot to the exposed side of his ribcage. But as Jin-ho fired, a fifth figure stepped through the smoking doorway. It wasn't an enforcer, it was Kang. The boss of the Red Crane Triad was a massive, scarred brute of a man, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked absurd beneath the heavy tactical vest he wore over it. He was carrying a heavy pump-action combat shotgun, and his eyes immediately locked onto Jin-ho. Kang smiled, a cruel, triumphant slash across his face. He saw Jin-ho's ruined, bloody shoulder. He saw the sluggish way the White Tiger moved. "Look at you, Jin-ho," Kang sneered, his voice booming over the ringing in the room. He racked the shotgun with a terrifyingly loud clack. The great White Tiger, bleeding out in a cage with the help. "I'm going to mount your head on my wall." Kang raised the shotgun, aiming directly at Jin-ho's chest. Jin-ho tried to bring his pistol up, but the loss of blood was catching up to him. His left arm felt like lead. He was a fraction of a second too slow. But Kang had made a fatal error. He hadn't looked at the help. Before Kang could pull the trigger, Betty moved. She didn't shoot. Her magazine was dry from suppressing the enforcers. She dropped the empty MP7 and launched herself forward. She closed the distance between the wall and Kang in 2 blindingly fast steps. She didn't try to wrestle the heavy shotgun away from the massive Triad boss. Instead, her hand blurred downward, drawing the serrated combat knife from her thigh sheath. With a brutal, upward thrust, she drove the blade deep into the vulnerable gap between Kang's tactical vest and his heavy belt. Kang roared, his eyes going wide with shock and agony. The shotgun blasted into the ceiling, raining sparks and shattered plaster down on them. He swung his massive arm, backhanding Betty across the face, with enough force to split her lip and send her stumbling backward. But Betty didn't fall. She caught her balance, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the steel floor, and instantly dropped into a low, predatory fighting stance, the bloody knife held out in front of her. Kang staggered, clutching his bleeding side, his face twisting into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He looked at the woman in the blood-soaked blouse, finally realizing that the intel he had bought from Choi was fundamentally flawed. This was no chef. "You bitch," Kang snarled, dropping the empty shotgun and reaching for the heavy revolver at his hip. He never cleared the holster. Jin-ho stepped up beside Betty. His face was a frozen mask of pure, beautiful violence. He leveled the Sig Sauer P226 directly at Kang's face. "No one speaks to her that way," Jin-ho whispered. He pulled the trigger twice. The twin shots echoed through the bunker like thunder. Kang's head snapped violently backward, and the massive boss of the Red Crane Triad collapsed backward, his body hitting the steel floor with a final, heavy thud. He didn't move again. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of the cooling thermite and the ragged, heavy breathing of the two survivors. The remaining enforcer, seeing his boss dead on the floor and facing the terrifying duo standing over him, dropped his weapon and threw his hands up in surrender. Jin-ho didn't even look at him. He fired one shot into the man's knee, shattering the joint, ensuring he wouldn't run before the White Tiger cleanup crew arrived. Then, Jin-ho let his arm drop to his side. The gun felt infinitely heavy. The adrenaline was finally, truly burning out, leaving nothing but pain and bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He swayed, his knees buckling. Betty caught him. She dropped the bloody knife and wrapped her arms around his waist, taking his weight, supporting him against her own bruised and battered body. "I've got you," she said fiercely, her voice shaking just a fraction as the reality of what they had just survived washed over her. "I've got you, Jin-ho." She helped him limp back toward the medical table, lowering him carefully onto the edge. He sat there, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pristine white bandage on his chest was blooming with a fresh circle of red, but the stitches had held. Betty stood between his knees, her hands resting gently on his uninjured shoulder. Her lip was split and bleeding from Kang's blow. Her face was smeared with soot and blood, and her hair was a wild, dark halo around her head. Jin-ho slowly raised his head. He looked at her. He didn't see the ruin of the panic room. He didn't see the bodies of his enemies bleeding out on his floor. He only saw her, the woman who had ripped a bullet from his chest, kissed him with the heat of a dying star, and stood side by side with him against the wolves at the door. He reached up with his left hand, his thumb gently wiping a smear of blood from her cheekbone. "You are not a chef," Jin-ho said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated with absolute, unshakable conviction. "I told you," Betty replied softly, a faint, weary smile touching the corners of her mouth. "I haven't been just a cook in a very long time." "No," Jin-ho corrected him, his eyes burning into hers, dark and intense and utterly devoted. "That is not what I mean." He tightened his grip on her face, leaning forward until their foreheads rested against one another. "You are not my employee. You are not my secret. You are not the weakness they thought they could exploit," Jin-ho vowed, the words ringing out in the bloody, smoke-filled room like a coronation. "You are my equal. You are the queen of this empire, Betty. You are the queen of the White Tiger." He pressed a fierce, bloody kiss to her forehead. "And anyone who ever threatens you again," Jin-ho swore, his voice dropping to a lethal, terrifying whisper, "will burn to ash." Dawn crept over Seoul, not with warmth, but with a cold, gray, unforgiving finality. The violent storm that had battered the city all night had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a bruised and weeping sky. The rain had reduced to a freezing drizzle, drifting through the gaping, blown-out ruin of Ryu Jin-ho's front doors. Inside the sprawling estate, the silence was heavier and more oppressive than the gunfire had been. The grand foyer was a tomb of shattered white marble, pulverized drywall, and the thick, inescapable stench of copper and spent cordite. Deep within the bowels of the mansion, the heavy steel door of the panic room stood wide open, its edges warped and blackened by thermite. The immediate danger had passed. The surviving Red Crane assassins had fled into the night, once their boss lay dead on the bunker floor, and the first wave of Jin-ho's lower-level perimeter guards had finally managed to secure the immediate grounds. But the syndicate was in absolute chaos. Jin-ho sat on the edge of the stainless steel medical table, a heavy black tactical jacket draped over his uninjured left shoulder to ward off the chill of the blood loss. His face was the color of old ash, drawn and haggard, but his dark eyes were burning with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The adrenaline of the firefight had receded, leaving behind a bone-deep agony radiating from the fresh sutures in his chest, but he refused to lie down. A king did not rule from his back. He watched the woman standing across the bunker. Betty was standing over the biohazard bin. In her hands, she held the ruined, blood-soaked remains of her crisp white chef's blouse and apron. She stared down at the fabric for a long, silent moment. That apron had been her shield. It had been her carefully constructed identity, the maternal tapestry she had woven around herself to hide from the ghosts of her past in New Orleans. It was the uniform of Mama Betty, the woman who created warmth and nourished souls. With a look of profound, quiet resignation, she dropped the ruined white fabric into the bin. Mama Betty was dead. The mender had returned. She turned around, and Jin-ho felt his breath catch in his throat, a sharp tug that had nothing to do with the bullet hole in his muscle. She had raided the panic room's armory while he rested. She was now dressed entirely in matte black, a form-fitting tactical shirt that clung to the lean, functional muscle of her torso, and heavy canvas cargo pants tucked into reinforced combat boots. She had pulled her dark, wild hair back into a tight, severe braid that left her striking face entirely exposed. There was no softness left in her. She looked like a blade forged in the dark, sharp, lethal, and devastatingly competent. She walked over to him, her boots making absolutely no sound on the steel floor. She stopped between his knees, reaching out to gently check the edges of his bandage. Her touch was professional, yet intensely possessive. "The bleeding has stopped," Betty said, her voice dropping into that low, even, clinical cadence that sent a shiver down his spine. "But you are running on fumes, Jin-ho. Your blood pressure is still dangerously low. If you push yourself too hard, the stitches will tear, and I will not be able to stop the internal hemorrhaging a second time." "I have enough blood left in me to finish this," Jin-ho rumbled, leaning his head forward to rest against her sternum for just a fraction of a second, drawing strength from the steady beat of her heart. The Red Cranes didn't orchestrate this alone. They bypassed the perimeter sensors. They knew the shift changes. They brought thermite for a bunker door they shouldn't have known existed. "An inside job," Betty confirmed, her hand coming up to rest on the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. "I have a name," Jin-ho said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Choi." "Your underboss?" Betty asked, her brow furrowing. She remembered the quiet, fiercely loyal man who sat at Jin-ho's right hand during the syndicate banquets. "The one you grew up with?" "That is what the decrypted files told me before the power was cut," Jin-ho said, pulling back to look into her eyes. "But files can be fabricated. Digital trails can be spoofed by a clever hacker to frame an innocent man. I will not execute my brother on the word of a glowing screen. Then we get the truth from a breathing source, Betty said. Her dark eyes shifted toward the corner of the panic room. Slumped against the steel wall, his hands zip-tied tightly behind his back, was the surviving Red Crane enforcer. He was the one Jin-Ho had shot in the knee. The man was pale and sweating profusely, his combat uniform soaked with his own blood, groaning quietly in the harsh fluorescent light. "Bring him up," Betty ordered, stepping away from Jin-Ho and moving toward a heavy, reinforced steel chair bolted to the floor near the surgical sink. Jin-Ho gave a sharp nod to the two loyal White Tiger guards who had been allowed into the room. They hauled the screaming enforcer off the floor and dragged him to the chair, strapping his wrists and ankles to the heavy metal frame. The man's shattered knee hung at a sickening, unnatural angle. Jin-Ho stood up from the medical table. The pain in his chest flared into a blinding white supernova, forcing a sharp hiss through his teeth, but he locked his jaw. He moved slowly, deliberately, projecting the aura of the untouchable monster the underworld believed him to be. He stood beside Betty, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the bleeding captive. "I am going to ask you a question," Jin-Ho said, his voice a flat, dead rasp that carried the weight of a graveyard. "You will answer it. If you lie, you will die slowly. If you tell the truth, I will allow my men to put a bullet in your head and end your suffering." The enforcer spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the floor. "Go to hell, Ryu. Kang is dead, but the Red Cranes will burn this city down around you. I ain't telling you nothing." Jin-Ho's face remained entirely blank. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a half-step back and looked at the woman beside him. "Your turn," Jin-Ho whispered. Betty didn't pick up a gun. She didn't pick up a knife. She simply walked over to the sterile medical tray sitting on the counter. She picked up a small stainless steel surgical probe and a pair of heavy metal forceps. She moved with terrifying, unhurried grace. She pulled up a rolling metal stool and sat down directly in front of the captive enforcer. "Look at me," Betty said. Her voice was smooth, rich, and utterly devoid of empathy. The enforcer sneered at her. "What are you going to do, bitch? Burn me with a frying pan? Kang told us about you, the boss's pet cook." Betty didn't flinch. She simply leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, the surgical probe twirling lazily between her long, elegant fingers. "I spent 10 years on the Gulf Coast, putting men back together after they were shredded by cartel violence," Betty began, her tone conversational, almost pleasant. "I know the human body better than you know the back of your own hand. I know exactly how many pounds of pressure it takes to snap a clavicle. I know which arteries you can sever to make a man bleed for hours without dying. And, most importantly," she suddenly drove the metal forceps directly into the open, ragged bullet wound on the man's shattered knee. The enforcer threw his head back and unleashed a blood-curdling scream, his body thrashing violently against the heavy straps of the steel chair. "I know exactly where every single nerve cluster is located," Betty finished, her voice turning to absolute ice. She didn't let go of the forceps. She twisted them, locking the heavy metal jaws directly onto the exposed peroneal nerve. "God! Stop! Stop!" The man shrieked, tears of sheer agony streaming down his face, his chest heaving as he fought against the restraints. "When you shoot a man in the knee, the bullet usually fragments on the patella," Betty lectured, her eyes dead and cold as she stared at the screaming assassin. "The shrapnel tears through the surrounding tissue. But the peroneal nerve, the one that controls the sensation in your lower leg, is remarkably resilient. It's right here, between the jaws of my forceps." She gave the tool a microscopic tug. The man convulsed, a wet, choking gargle tearing from his throat as the pain overloaded his nervous system. Jinho stood behind her, watching in absolute, mesmerized awe. The terrifying, beautiful brutality of the woman he loved was breathtaking. She was a master of her craft, a dark angel of anatomy, dismantling the enemy with a clinical precision that made traditional torture look like child's play. "I can keep you hovering on the exact edge of passing out from pain for the next 6 hours," Betty promised softly, leaning in until her face was inches from his. "I will not let you die. I will keep your heart beating, just so I can continue to work on this nerve. Unless you tell the boss exactly what he wants to know." She released the pressure on the forceps just a fraction of a millimeter. The man slumped forward, gasping for air like a drowning victim, spit and blood dripping from his chin. "Who gave you the bunker codes?" Betty demanded. "Choi," the man sobbed, his voice cracking, broken instantly by the sheer terror of the woman sitting in front of him. "It was Choi. He gave us the blueprints. He disabled the backup generators. He told Kang exactly where you would be." Jinho felt the last shred of hope in his chest turn to dust. His brother, the boy who had split stolen rice cakes with him in the slums of Busan. "Why?" Jinho asked, stepping forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The White Tiger is the most powerful syndicate in the country. He sat at my right hand. He had wealth, power, territory. Why sell it to the Red Cranes?" The enforcer looked up at Jinho, his eyes wide and trembling. "He didn't sell it. He bought it. He promised Kang the Incheon ports in exchange for a hit squad." "A hit squad for what?" Jinho demanded. "For you," the bleeding man gasped. "Choi didn't just want you dead. He wanted it to look like a triad war so he could step up and take the throne of the White Tiger without the capos questioning it. He said you were unfit." Betty's grip on the forceps tightened slightly. "Unfit how?" The enforcer swallowed hard, his terrified eyes darting between the towering Mafia boss and the deadly medic. He said Jinho had gone soft, that he was losing his edge. He told Kang that the Great White Tiger was spending his nights playing house with a civilian cook. He said you were weak because of her. He wanted her dead to break you, and then he wanted you dead to take the crown. The words hung in the sterile air of the panic room, toxic and heavy. Jinho looked at Betty. The revelation was a jagged knife twisting in his gut. Choi hadn't just betrayed him out of greed. He had betrayed him out of disgust. His oldest friend had looked at the one piece of light in Jinho's miserable, bloody life and decided it was a cancer that needed to be cut out. Choi had painted the target on Betty's back not just to hurt him, but because he genuinely believed she was a disease ruining the syndicate. Betty stood up. She pulled the forceps entirely out of the man's knee, wiping the blood on a sterile towel. She didn't look hurt by the insult. She looked furious. "He thought I made you weak," Betty said, turning to look at Jinho, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, lethal fire. "He doesn't know you," Jinho whispered, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw. "He doesn't know what you are." "He's going to find out," Betty promised, her voice hard as diamond. She turned to the 2 White Tiger guards standing silently by the door. "Take this piece of trash outside and fulfill your boss's promise." The guards hauled the sobbing enforcer out of the bunker. A few moments later, a single muffled gunshot echoed from the ruined foyer. The silence returned to the panic room, but it was no longer heavy. It was charged, humming with a kinetic, violent energy. "If Choi orchestrated this," Betty said, moving to the armory wall and grabbing fresh magazines for her MP7, "then he is not going to wait for a phone call from Kang to confirm the kill. The storm has passed. It's dawn. He is going to come here to discover the tragedy." Jinho nodded, his tactical mind clicking into gear, overriding the physical pain tearing at his chest. "He will come under the guise of a rescue. He will bring his own loyalists, men who are loyal to him, not to the crown. If he finds me alive, he will finish the job himself in the confusion, claim the Red Cranes did it, and declare himself the new boss. How many men? Betty asked, slamming a magazine into her submachine gun. A full security detachment, Jin-Ho calculated grimly. At least 30 heavily armed hitters. My lower-level guards on the perimeter won't stop the underboss from entering the estate. They don't know he's the traitor. And we have what? Betty asked, looking around the ruined bunker. You, with a hole in your chest. Me. And the 2 guards outside? We are severely outnumbered, Jin-Ho agreed, walking over to the heavy steel operating table and picking up his Sig Sauer. He checked the chamber with his left hand, his face a mask of cold, promised violence. If we stay in this bunker, he will simply seal the door and let us suffocate. If we run, his men will cut us down in the courtyard. I spent a decade running from the violence, Jin-Ho, Betty said, stepping up beside him. She reached out, her hand resting firmly against the Kevlar vest covering his heart. I am not running anymore. This is my house. This is my kitchen. And nobody comes into my home and tries to kill my man. Jin-Ho's breath hitched at the absolute undeniable claim in her words. My man. The possessiveness of it settled deep into his bones, acting like a shot of pure adrenaline. He leaned down and captured her lips in a fierce, hard, bruising kiss. It was a seal, a promise, and a war cry all at once. When he pulled back, the dead, freezing aura of the white tiger had returned to his eyes in full force. Then we do not run, Jin-Ho whispered against her lips. We build a trap. He turned and limped heavily toward the security console on the far wall of the panic room. The primary monitors were dead, fried by the explosion in the foyer, but the secondary, hardened analog cameras were still feeding grainy, black and white footage to the small auxiliary screens. Jin-Ho leaned his weight on the console, his eyes scanning the monitors. Dawn had fully broken now. The pale, watery light of the morning sun was illuminating the devastating ruin of his estate, and there, rolling up the long, winding driveway toward the shattered front gates, was a convoy of 4 massive, armored black SUVs. The vehicles came to a halt in the circular driveway. The doors opened simultaneously, and 36 men poured out. They were dressed in sharp tactical suits, carrying heavy assault rifles, moving with the aggressive, coordinated speed of a professional hit squad preparing to breach. And from the lead vehicle stepped Choi. He looked exactly the same as he had the last time Jin-Ho saw him. Impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, his face set in a mask of grave, practiced concern. He was playing the part of the devoted underboss rushing to save his king, but Jin-Ho could see the predatory tightness in his old friend's shoulders, the eager, hungry look in his eyes as he surveyed the destroyed front doors. Choi raised his hand, signaling his loyalists to fan out and secure the perimeter. He drew his own custom silver sidearm and began to walk toward the gaping entrance of the foyer. He's here, Jin-Ho said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Betty stepped up to the console, staring at the grainy image of the traitor. She rested her hand lightly on the grip of the knife strapped to her thigh. He brought an army, she noted coldly. He brought lambs to the slaughter. Jin-Ho corrected him. He reached under the console and flipped open a small, clear plastic cover, revealing a heavy red toggle switch. It was the override for the mansion's internal defense grid, a system Choi assumed he had disabled from the outside. He thinks I am soft, Jin-Ho said, his lips curling into a cruel, terrifying smile. He thinks I am weak. Let us show my brother exactly what happens when you corner a tiger in his den. Jin-Ho slammed the red toggle switch forward. Deep within the walls of the sprawling estate, the heavy, metallic clanking of reinforced blast shutters began to echo, slamming down over every window and exit, sealing the mansion entirely. The trap was sprung. The heavy metallic groan of the mansion sealing itself shut echoed like the gates of purgatory slamming closed. Steel blast shutters, thick enough to withstand a mortar strike, crashed down over every floor-to-ceiling window and every exterior door. The morning light was instantly choked off, plunging the sprawling estate back into an eerie, suffocating twilight, illuminated only by the rhythmic, sweeping pulse of amber emergency strobes. Outside, the traitorous underboss and his hit squad were trapped within the courtyard walls. Inside, the surviving infiltrators who had breached the foyer were now locked in a cage with a wounded tiger and a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a human being. "They'll split up," Jin-Ho rasped, his left hand gripping the Sig Sauer as he leaned heavily against the panic room's control console. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead, the physical toll of the sniper's bullet warring with the sheer, unadulterated adrenaline of betrayal. Choi knows the primary layout. He'll send a team to the upper suites, thinking we retreated to my bedroom. He'll take the main corridors to sweep the ground floor. Betty checked the magazine of her MP7, the sharp clack of metal seating against metal ringing out in the bunker. She didn't look at the monitors. She looked at the man she loved. She saw the gray pallor of his skin, the tight, rigid lines of pain bracketing his mouth. "He knows the main corridors," Betty said, her rich New Orleans drawl returning, dropping an octave into something low, feral, and exceptionally dangerous. "But he doesn't know the veins of this house. He doesn't know the staff routes, the secondary pantries, the dumbwaiter shafts. He's an aristocrat of the underworld, Jin-Ho. He's never had to navigate a house like a servant." A dark, beautiful smirk touched the corner of Jin-Ho's lips. It was a terrifying expression, filled with the promise of absolute ruin. "Lead the way, my queen." They slipped out of the panic room and into the belly of the mansion. The ensuing hunt was not a chaotic firefight. It was a surgical, terrifyingly efficient dissection. They moved through the narrow, unlit service corridors that ran parallel to the grand hallways. Betty moved like a shadow, her boots soundless against the concrete subfloors, her senses fine-tuned by a decade of surviving the brutal, claustrophobic cartel wars of the Gulf Coast. Jin-Ho followed her, his breathing shallow to protect his shattered collarbone, his offhand remarkably steady. They became a perfectly synchronized unit of destruction. When a squad of 4 heavily armed loyalists crept down the East Wing Art Gallery, their tactical lights sweeping over priceless Renaissance canvases, they never saw the threat coming. Betty slipped out from a hidden linen closet behind them. She didn't use the submachine gun. It was too loud, too chaotic. She drew the matte black combat knife. She took the rear guard down with a swift, brutal strike to the carotid artery, catching his body before it could hit the hardwood floor, lowering him with absolute silence. As the second man turned at the faint rustle of fabric, Jin-Ho stepped out from the opposite service door. Despite the agonizing fire in his chest, his aim was flawless. 2 suppressed coughs from the Sig Sauer sent the remaining 3 men crashing to the floor, dead before their brains could register the ambush. "Clear," Jin-Ho whispered, leaning his left shoulder against the silk-lined wall, his chest heaving. Betty was at his side in a heartbeat, her hand pressing gently against his uninjured ribcage, checking his pulse with her thumb. "You're burning up. The local anesthetic is wearing off. We need to end this." "Choi is mine," Jin-Ho breathed, his dark eyes fixed on the end of the corridor. "I have to be the one." "He's heading for the West Wing," Betty said, her eyes tracking the muddy footprints on the Persian rugs. "He's looking for the security hub, or he's looking for the kitchen to find a service exit he can blow open. I'll cut through the dining room and flank him. You take the main hall, pin him." "Betty," Jin-Ho started, the protective territorial instinct of the Mafia boss flaring up, terrified of letting her out of his sight. "I am the mender," she interrupted softly, pressing a quick, fierce kiss to his jaw. I survived worse men than him before you ever tasted my cooking. Give me 2 minutes. She melted into the shadows of the dining room before he could argue. The kitchen, usually a sanctuary of warmth, copper, and the intoxicating aromas of toasted spices, was now a tomb of cold stainless steel and plaster dust. The emergency strobes painted the white marble islands in harsh, flashing bursts of orange light. Choi stepped through the swinging double doors, his custom silver pistol raised, his breathing ragged. He was alone. The men he had sent to secure the perimeter had stopped answering their radios. The silent, suffocating darkness of the mansion was beginning to gnaw at his nerves. He had expected to find Jin-ho bleeding out, begging for mercy. He had expected an easy crown. Instead, he was walking through a graveyard of his own men. "Jin-ho!" Choi yelled, his voice cracking slightly, the sound echoing off the hanging copper pots. "It's over! The Red Cranes have the ports. Your capos will kneel to me by noon. Come out and die like a king, not a rat in the walls." "He's not a rat," a smooth, dark voice echoed from the shadows of the walk-in pantry. Choi whipped around, leveling his silver pistol at the sound. Betty stepped out into the flashing amber light. She no longer wore the crisp white apron of the subservient cook. Dressed in blood-spattered black tactical gear, her wild hair pulled back, the serrated combat knife held loosely in her right hand. She looked like a demon summoned from the depths of the underworld. Choi blinked, a sneer of pure, arrogant disgust twisting his handsome face. He didn't lower the gun, but his posture relaxed minutely. It was just the cook, the civilian, the weakness that had ruined his best friend. "You?" Choi spat, stepping further into the kitchen. "The American whore who made the white tiger forget his teeth. I told Kang to put a bullet in your head first to make him watch." Betty didn't flinch. She stood completely still, her dark eyes evaluating him with the cold, clinical detachment of a mortician. "You told Kang a lot of things, and now Kang is lying on the floor of my bunker, choking on his own blood. You underestimated this house, Choi, but more importantly, you underestimated me." Choi laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You're a chef, holding a knife. What are you going to do?" "Julie and me?" He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at the center of her chest. "I'm going to blow a hole through your heart, and then I'm going to tell Jin-ho you begged for your miserable life." "A chef," Betty murmured, her voice dripping with lethal calm. "Let me give you a recipe for ruin, little boy." She didn't run at him. She didn't scream. With a flick of her wrist that was entirely invisible in the flashing strobe light, she threw the heavy combat knife. It wasn't a killing blow. She didn't aim for his chest. The heavy, serrated blade sailed across the kitchen and embedded itself perfectly, brutally, straight through Choi's right wrist. Choi shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute agony, his fingers involuntarily opening. The silver pistol clattered uselessly onto the marble floor. Before the gun even finished skidding across the tiles, Betty was moving. She crossed the 10 feet of kitchen floor with terrifying, explosive speed. Choi lunged forward with his uninjured left hand, trying to grab her, trying to use his superior size. Betty ducked under his wild swing. She grabbed his left arm, pivoting her hips, using his own momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the heavy stainless steel prep table. Choi gasped as the wind was knocked out of him. He tried to push himself up, blood pouring from his impaled right wrist, painting the pristine metal crimson. Betty didn't give him a fraction of a second to recover. She reached over to the magnetic knife strip on the wall above the table. Her hand closed around the black handle of her favorite 8-inch high-carbon Wusthof chef's knife, the same knife she had once used to teach Jin-ho how to chop vegetables. She brought the blade down, driving it through the back of Choi's left hand, pinning it permanently to the heavy wooden cutting board that rested on the steel table. Choi howled, his knees buckling, his body sagging against the table as he found himself completely immobilized, crucified to the prep station by his own arrogance. Betty stepped back, her breathing even, her eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You look at a woman in an apron, and you assume she knows nothing but servitude," Betty whispered, leaning in close to his ear, her voice slicing through his screams. "But a woman who knows how to break down a side of beef knows exactly where every joint, tendon, and artery is in the human body. You came into my kitchen. You threatened my man. Now you bleed." The swinging doors of the kitchen kicked open. Jin-ho stood in the threshold. He looked like the god of war, battered, bleeding, and magnificent. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the blood on the floor, the silver pistol abandoned by the stove, and his oldest friend pinned to the prep table, weeping in agony. And then Jin-ho looked at Betty. The raw, primal awe in his gaze was blinding. He didn't see a monster. He didn't see a cartel medic. He saw a queen who had just defended her throne with absolute, devastating perfection. The love he felt for her in that moment was a physical weight, heavier and more profound than the pain in his chest. He limped slowly into the kitchen, his boots crunching on the broken glass of a shattered spice jar. "Jin-ho," Choi sobbed, his head turning as he strained against the knives pinning his hands. "Jin-ho, please. We were brothers. We bled together in Busan. She's a witch, Jin-ho. She's ruined you." Jin-ho stopped a few feet from the table. He looked down at the man who had been his right hand for 15 years. There was no anger left in the white tiger's face. There was only a cold, abyssal emptiness. "You didn't bleed with me today, Choi," Jin-ho said quietly. "You sent men to my home to kill the only piece of my soul that was still clean. You thought she made me weak." Jin-ho raised the Sig Sauer, aiming it directly at the back of Choi's head. "She didn't make me weak," Jin-ho whispered, the words echoing with finality in the ruined kitchen. "She made me absolute." He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. Choi's body went instantly limp, sagging heavily against the stainless steel, his blood mingling with the plaster dust and the scattered spices of Betty's sanctuary. Jin-ho lowered the gun. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the kitchen pressing in on them. Then he swayed, the last dregs of his adrenaline finally burning out, his knees giving way as the blood loss demanded its toll. Betty caught him before he hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around his broad chest, mindful of his wound, pulling him down gently until they were both sitting on the cold tiles. She cradled his head against her shoulder, rocking him slowly, her hands running through his dark hair. "It's over," she murmured, pressing her lips to his temple. "It's over, my king. I've got you." Jin-ho closed his eyes, turning his face into the curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of gunpowder and jasmine. "Send for the capos," Jin-ho managed to say, his voice a low, exhausted rasp. "Send for the remaining lieutenants. Let them see this. Let them see the body." An hour later, the amber strobes were shut off, replaced by the harsh glare of tactical work lights. The blast shutters had been raised, letting the pale, weak morning sun bleed into the ruined foyer. 7 of the highest-ranking capos of the White Tiger Syndicate stood in a semicircle in the destroyed entryway. They had been summoned by Jin-ho's loyal guards, dragged from their beds and safe houses to witness the aftermath of the failed coup. They looked at the bullet-riddled walls, the blood-stained marble, and the bodies of the Red Crane assassins being unceremoniously bagged by the cleanup crews. But mostly, they looked at the stairs. Jin-ho sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase. He had refused to go to the hospital. A fresh, thick bandage was strapped across his chest, and a heavy black trench coat was draped over his shoulders. He looked pale, battered, and entirely terrifying. At his feet lay the body of Choi, dropped there by the guards as a stark, undeniable message. And standing right beside Jin-ho, resting her hand lightly on his uninjured shoulder, was Betty. She had washed the soot from her face, but she still wore the tactical gear, the combat knife strapped to her thigh, her posture radiating absolute lethal authority. The capos shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their boss and the woman they had always dismissed as the hired help. "Look closely at the man on the floor," Jin-ho commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap to the hardened criminals standing before him. "That is the price of treason. Choi believed that my heart was a weakness to be exploited. He believed that the woman standing beside me was a civilian who could be used to break me." Jin-ho reached up, his large, scarred hand covering Betty's fingers where they rested on his shoulder. He intertwined their fingers, a public, undeniable display of devotion that sent a shockwave through the ranks. "Let there be no misunderstandings," Jin-ho continued, his dark eyes locking onto each capo in turn, ensuring the message was branded into their minds. "Betty is not my chef. She is not my employee. She is the queen of this empire. She holds my life in her hands, and she holds the life of this syndicate in her hands. She is untouchable." He leaned forward slightly, the aura of the white tiger flaring with terrifying intensity. "If any man looks at her with disrespect, if any rival syndicate breathes her name, if any one of you questions her authority," Jin-ho's voice dropped to a lethal, freezing register. "I will not just kill you, I will erase your entire bloodline from the face of the earth. Am I understood?" The capos immediately bowed, bending at the waist in absolute trembling submission. "Yes, boss." Jin-ho leaned back against the stairs, exhaustion finally settling deep into his bones. He looked up at Betty, the terrifying mask melting away, leaving only the man who loved her with every shattered piece of his soul. "Take me upstairs, Betty," he murmured. "I want to go home." 6 weeks later, the physical scars of the coup had been entirely erased. The grand foyer of the estate featured new, flawless white marble, an even more opulent chandelier, and reinforced front doors that no amount of thermite could easily breach. The syndicate had stabilized, the Red Crane territories had been absorbed, and the name of the White Tiger was spoken with even more reverent terror on the streets of Seoul. But the true transformation was not in the architecture, it was in the heart of the home. The massive dining room usually reserved for syndicate banquets and formal stiff dinners was quiet. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft, warm light of crystal sconces. At the head of the table sat Ryu Jin-ho. The sling was finally gone from his right arm, though he moved with a careful, deliberate grace. He wore a crisp white shirt, the collar undone, his dark eyes clear and at peace. To his immediate right, seated not as a guest, but as an equal, was Mama Betty. She wore a breathtaking emerald green silk dress that draped beautifully over her dark skin, a diamond tennis bracelet, the one she had packed away on that terrible night, glinting on her wrist. She was no longer the hired help. She was the undisputed queen of the underworld, a woman whose mere presence commanded the absolute respect of every capo and enforcer in the city. They knew who had dug the bullet from the boss's chest. They knew who had pinned the traitor to the table. But tonight, the doors to the dining room were locked. The guards were stationed far down the hall. Betty stood up from her chair, offering Jin-ho a soft, secretive smile. She walked over to the adjacent private kitchenette, a smaller, incredibly high-end space built just off the dining room. She had surrendered the main industrial kitchen to a team of executive chefs imported from Paris, but this small space was hers alone. She picked up 2 steaming ceramic bowls from the counter and carried them to the table, setting one down in front of Jin-ho. The scent hit him immediately. Toasted garlic, bruised ginger, and the bright, wicked heat of Scotch bonnet peppers. It was the exact same fiery, complex stew she had served him on the night he had first realized he was falling in love with her. Jin-ho looked down at the bowl, then up at the magnificent woman taking her seat beside him. "I thought the Queen of the White Tiger didn't cook anymore," Jin-ho teased softly, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw with his thumb. Betty leaned into his touch, her dark eyes sparkling with warmth, love, and a hint of that fierce, unyielding fire that had saved his life. "The Queen doesn't cook for the syndicate," Betty corrected him, her New Orleans drawl wrapping around him like a heavy velvet blanket. She picked up her silver spoon. "But a woman will always cook for the man who worships the ground she walks on. Now eat your stew, Jin-ho, before it gets cold." Jin-ho smiled, a true, genuine expression that reached his eyes and banished the demons to the dark. He picked up his spoon, the king of the underworld finally, perfectly, at peace, in the sanctuary of his queen's heart.